The Judgment Hall of the Velthari Conclave was carved from a single asteroid, hollowed over 3 centuries into something that resembled a cathedral and functioned like a court. Gravity was artificial here, layered in competing fields that the Velthari navigated by instinct, but which made Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hale feel like he was perpetually stepping onto an escalator that wasn't moving. He stood at the center of the chamber floor and kept his spine straight. Around him, the court rose in concentric rings, 12 tiers of Velthari officials, all female, all watching him with the politely restrained curiosity of beings who had studied humans for 15 years, but still found them faintly baffling. The Velthari were tall, pale as chalk, with 4 arms folded in varying configurations that Marcus had learned to read like semaphore. 2 arms crossed at the chest, neutral attention. The upper pair held still while the lower pair moved, active disapproval. All 4 loose and slightly spread, amusement. Most of the tiers showed the amusement configuration. That wasn't encouraging. Queen Saravath sat at the apex, on a throne that wasn't really a throne, more a raised dais with a chair that happened to look ancient and important. She was the oldest Velthari Marcus had ever met, which meant she was approximately 400 years old and looked 40 by human standards. Her skin had a faint luminescent quality, like moonlight had been pressed into the tissue itself, and her 4 eyes, 2 on each side of a face that was almost human if you didn't look directly at it, were currently fixed on Marcus, with an expression he had learned to translate as asterisk, "You have exhausted my goodwill in a way I find almost impressive." He had, in fairness, earned it. "Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hale of the Terran Exploration Corps," said the Arbiter, a smaller Velthari woman standing to the Queen's left with a data scroll the size of a surfboard. "You are charged with the following: 1 count of unauthorized modification to Conclave Navigation Buoy Network, Sector 7. 1 count of rerouting a diplomatic convoy through a meteor field, which you described in your official incident report as a shortcut. 1 count of winning 17 consecutive games of chance against the Conclave's senior trade delegates, which you then characterized as beginner's luck." She paused. "You are human. There is no such thing as 17 consecutive games of beginner's luck." Marcus did not argue this. He had, in fact, been counting cards. "And finally," the Arbiter continued, her lower pair of arms spreading slightly, that was the amused configuration, he noted with alarm. 1 count of teaching the docking staff your Earth card game, asterisk poker, resulting in the loss of what they describe as significant personal funds, by 3 members of the Queen's diplomatic corps. The murmur that passed through the tiers was not, he thought, the sound of outrage. It sounded more like suppressed laughter. Queen Saravath had not moved. She studied him the way a naturalist might study a particularly energetic specimen. "Lieutenant Commander," she said. Her voice was the sound of something very old speaking very quietly. In Galactic Standard, it was perfectly clear, slightly formal, and carried the weight of 4 centuries of absolute authority. "Do you have anything to say before sentence is delivered?" Marcus thought about it. "With respect, Your Majesty, the navigation buoys were miscalibrated. The convoy made it through the meteor field fine. The card games were consensual, and I left very detailed poker instructions with the docking staff, so they'll be able to recoup their losses from other visitors." A longer silence. "You are," said Queen Saravath, "without question the most persistently inconvenient human being in this quadrant." "I've been told that before, Your Majesty." "I do not mean it as a compliment." "I know." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then something shifted in her expression, not quite softening, but adjusting the way a chess player adjusts their reading of a board. "The Terran Exploration Corps has requested leniency on your behalf," she said. "Your commanding officer has submitted a report describing you as," she glanced at the data scroll the Arbiter extended, "irreplaceable, infuriating and almost certainly correct about the navigation buoys. Marcus thought he probably owed Commander Chen a very good bottle of whiskey. Nonetheless, Lieutenant Commander, this court does not permit your category of disruptions to pass without consequence. We therefore sentence you to a period of reassignment, not expulsion, which you may consider mercy, to a posting within the conclave itself. He waited. You will serve a rotation of 60 standard cycles in the Velthari Unified Medical and Research Division, said Queen Saravath. Specifically, Unit 12. A sound moved through the chamber again. This time it was different, a kind of collective intake of breath, followed by what Marcus could only describe as restrained delight. Tiers of alien women adjusting their arm configurations simultaneously, all in the direction of amusement. Unit 12, he repeated. The Xenobiology and Adaptive Species Research Unit, said Queen Saravath. It is staffed exclusively by female Velthari researchers. They have been attempting to obtain a living human subject for study purposes for some time. The Terran Corps has been reluctant to provide one. A pause so slight it was almost undetectable. You will serve as their subject, in a supervisory capacity. He looked up at the tiers. 12 levels of Velthari women, many of whom were now showing a configuration he had not yet catalogued. Upper arms still, lower arms extended slightly forward, which he thought might be anticipation. A supervisory capacity, he said. You will hold the rank of Senior Research Associate, which is technically above the unit's current staffing grade. This was deliberate. The unit's lead researcher, Senior Xenobiologist Tyrath, was the one who submitted the formal request for a human subject. The Queen's expression adjusted again, and Marcus had the sudden and unsettling sense that he was looking at someone who had thought about this carefully and found it genuinely entertaining. I suggest you pack efficiently, Lieutenant Commander. Unit 12 has been waiting quite some time. The transport pod that delivered him to the medical division's outer ring was piloted by a young Velthari officer who said nothing for the entire journey, but whose lower arms kept doing small, rapid movements that Marcus had catalogued as excitement. He had 3 duffel bags, his personal data tablet, a deck of cards he decided to leave packed, and approximately no idea what he was walking into. The pod docked with a soft, resonant click. The door opened onto a corridor that smelled of recycled air and something faintly herbal, the Velthari equivalent of a hospital smell, he supposed, though nothing here mapped exactly onto hospital. The walls were that pale gray-green the conclave used for functional spaces, lit from above with bioluminescent panels that cycled through a slow, subtle warm-to-cool rhythm he'd been told was meant to be calming. A Velthari woman was waiting for him at the corridor's end. She was taller than most, nearly 2 meters, which put her at about 15 centimeters above Marcus, though in the conclave's slightly lower gravity it hardly felt that way. Her skin was the blue-pale variety, with markings along the neck and collarbone that were characteristic of the Eastern Velthari lineages. For eyes, the inner pair a deep amber, the outer pair a paler gold. She wore the white and silver uniform of the research division with the senior badge of a xenobiologist, and she was holding a data tablet in her upper left arm and a stylus in her upper right. Her lower arms were folded across her chest. That was the neutral configuration. Professional, he filed it. Lieutenant Commander Hale, she said. Senior Xenobiologist Tyrath, he said. She looked at him. He had the impression of someone who had prepared extensively for a meeting and was now recalibrating in real time. You are shorter than the files indicated, she said. My files list me at 182 centimeters. Yes, that is shorter than I expected. He decided not to pursue this. I've been told I'm assigned to Unit 12. You are assigned *to me, she said, and then paused as if hearing it back and deciding that was an accurate description, but perhaps not the most diplomatic phrasing. You are assigned to this unit under my supervision. I submitted the requisition for a human research subject approximately 3 years ago. I had begun to believe the request would be permanently denied. Her Majesty had other plans. Apparently. She turned and began walking back down the corridor. Her stride was long and efficient, and she expected him to keep up, which he did. I should inform you that the other members of Unit 12 are aware of your arrival. There was some discussion. What kind of discussion? She glanced at him over her inner shoulder, which the Velthari could do in a way that humans physically could not. It always looked slightly uncanny to him. The enthusiastic kind, she said, and then seemed to decide that was all he needed to know for now. Part 2, the unit. Unit 12's main lab occupied a roughly circular space about the size of a basketball court, with workstations arranged in arcs and equipment Marcus couldn't fully identify lining the outer walls. The ceiling was high, and the lighting was the same slow-cycling bioluminescent warm-to-cool he'd seen in the corridor, which he was already finding oddly soothing. There were 11 Velthari women in the room. They all looked at him when he walked in. The variety was striking even by Velthari standards, different heights, different skin tones across the blue-white-silver-gray spectrum, different eye color combinations. A few wore research uniforms. Others had the more casual off-duty coveralls he associated with long shifts, ages that he couldn't accurately estimate. The Velthari didn't age visibly the way humans did. You could really only tell by the markings, which grew more complex over time, and he wasn't yet fluent enough in Velthari lineage markings to read them with confidence. They were all doing the arm configuration he'd cataloged from the courtroom tiers. Upper arm still, lower arm slightly forward. Anticipation. This is Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hale, said Tyrath, in a tone that was professional and calm and gave nothing away. He is our senior research associate, per the Conclave's placement order. He will be assisting the unit's work for 60 standard cycles. Assisting, said one of the researchers from the second arc of workstations. She was compact by Velthari standards and had the silver-gray skin of the northern lineages, and she was looking at Marcus with an expression that was impossible to read but felt thoroughly interested. He is the human. He is the human, Tyrath confirmed. He looks, another researcher started. Smaller than I expected, the compact one said. You all expected different sizes, Marcus said. I'm exactly the size I am. A pause. Then the compact researcher did something he hadn't seen a Velthari do yet. She made a short, soft sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Not polite, genuine. He speaks well, she said. This seemed to be a compliment. I speak Galactic Standard, Marcus said. I can also manage about 40 words of Velthari, most of which are food-related. Which 40 words? Asked a researcher from the far side of the room, leaning forward over her workstation. Bread, water, the thing that tastes like pepper but isn't, the thing that tastes like nothing but is apparently important, several types of fruit. The word for too hot, the word for also too hot. And he paused, a phrase I was taught by a docking officer that I later discovered means something impolite at dinner. 3 of the researchers did the same short laugh as the compact one. Tyrath looked at him. I see the files did not fully capture your personality. The files never do. She turned to the room. Begin your standard cycle work. I will orient Lieutenant Commander Hale to the unit's protocols and then conduct his baseline assessment. Baseline assessment, Marcus repeated, as the room shifted back toward its normal activity, though he noticed several researchers angling their workstation views in his direction. Physical, cognitive, biochemical, said Tyrath. Don't be alarmed. It is non-invasive. Mostly, said the compact researcher from her workstation, without looking up. Marcus looked at Tyrath. Mostly, Tyrath confirmed, in the tone of someone who considered this a reasonable margin. The orientation took the better part of the morning. Tyrath walked him through the unit's research focus, xenobiology, which he'd known, but specifically xenobiology as it related to convergent and divergent biological strategies between species. Unit 12 was studying the question of why some traits evolved independently across multiple unrelated species, while others appeared unique to their home worlds. Humans, said Tyrath, standing at a display wall covered in overlapping biological diagrams, are of particular interest because of the degree to which you exhibit convergent traits with species you had no contact with prior to expansion. You have analogous cardiovascular systems, with the Dravathi despite being separated by 11,000 light-years. Your immune response architecture resembles the Kavath in ways that should, statistically, be impossible. And yet here I am, Marcus said. And yet, we have studied human biological samples extensively, video records, physiological data from the exchange treaty. She paused. But there are limits to what samples and data convey. What kind of limits? She looked at him steadily. You are a living system. Living systems do things that samples do not. They move through space. They respond to stimuli. They have internal states that affect external behavior. A pause. When I submitted the requisition for a human subject, I specified a subject who was cooperative, communicative, and reasonably tolerant of study. The Queen sent you me instead. Yes, something in her voice that wasn't quite amusement, though I notice you have not objected. He thought about it. Standing in a lab full of alien women who were genuinely curious about him, on a posting that was theoretically a punishment, studying biology. He'd done worse. He'd done worse last month. I'm a scientist too, he said. Or I was, before the Corps made me into a navigator. Tyrath's inner eyes, she had the focus of looking with those two rather than the outer pair when she was paying close attention, fixed on him. What was your field? Evolutionary biology, before the expansion, before the Corps. A silence. You, she said, are going to be considerably more interesting than the files suggested. I'm starting to suspect that's why the Queen sent me specifically. Tyrath looked at him a moment longer, then she turned back to the display wall. The baseline assessment, come. Part 3, what they wanted to know. The assessment room was smaller than the main lab, with examination equipment that Marcus recognized in broad strokes and couldn't identify in specifics. He had been in Velthari medical facilities before. The Corps required a standard medical integration briefing before any long-term conclave posting, and he had learned that their diagnostic approach was thorough in ways that felt invasive but technically weren't. What he had not expected, and what he found increasingly true as the cycles passed, was that staying late in the lab didn't feel like staying late. It felt like staying. The distinction mattered to him in a way that took him a while to articulate even to himself. The compact researcher, her name was Kariath, he'd learned, and she was the unit's biochemist, was present along with Tyrath and a third researcher named Orvash, who handled the physiological monitoring equipment and had said approximately 4 words to Marcus total, but had been watching him with an intensity that was somehow not threatening, just extremely focused. Heart rate, respiratory rate, neural response baseline, said Tyrath. If you would sit. He sat on the indicated surface. It was designed for Velthari proportions, slightly too wide but manageable. The monitoring equipment extended around him in a loose arc. Humans, said Kariath, adjusting a sensor with her upper arm while making notes on a tablet with her lower, have a single cardiac organ. One heart, yes. It operates without redundancy. That's correct. She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to read, as I find this alarming and also fascinating. What happens if it fails? We die generally. She wrote something on her tablet. The note seemed longer than the answer warranted. The Velthari have 3 auxiliary cardiac loops, Tyrath said, from beside the display monitoring his readings. A primary failure is not fatal unless the auxiliaries are also compromised. I know, we find that impressive. You find it impressive, Tyreth said slowly. We find the fact that you function at all with one heart to be. She searched for the word, structurally bold. I've heard it called other things. Reckless, offered Kiriath. Efficient, said Marcus. One heart is one thing to maintain, fuel, and protect. One heart is one point of catastrophic failure. One heart means the rest of the chest cavity is available for other things. Humans have very large lung capacity relative to body size. A silence. Orvash made a note. Kiriath made a note. Tyreth looked at the monitoring display and said, Your resting heart rate is 63 beats per minute. That's normal for me. At rest, she said, you are completely calm. Should I not be? She glanced at him. You are surrounded by beings who consider you a research subject, in an unfamiliar facility, under a disciplinary posting from the Velthari Queen herself. Most beings would show elevated stress markers. Marcus thought about it. The lab smelled like that faint herbal thing. The lighting was cycling slowly through warm. 11 alien women had looked at him with curiosity rather than hostility, which was a better start to a posting than he'd had before, and the lead researcher was clearly brilliant and was currently looking at his vital signs like they were the most interesting data she'd seen in a year. I'm among scientists, he said, working in a lab talking about biology. He paused. This is the most comfortable I've been in 3 months. Another silence. You, said Tyreth, are a very unusual human. I've been told that too. He stayed in the assessment room for most of that morning. The questions were genuinely interesting, not the clinical battery he'd expected, but something more like a structured conversation with equipment running in the background. Tyreth asked about sleep architecture. He told her humans needed 7 to 9 hours in a continuous block, which she found statistically alarming in a creature that also had only one heart. You are offline for a third of every day, she said. We're not offline. We're consolidating. Memory formation, tissue repair, immune function, most of the maintenance work happens in sleep. You are vulnerable during this period. Deeply, we lose most of our environmental awareness. We produce sounds sometimes. We have elaborate visual hallucinations that our brains generate internally. She had stopped writing. She was looking at him with what he was now fairly confident was the expression of someone who had just discovered that a fact they thought they understood was significantly more strange than they'd realized. The hallucinations are meaningful to you. Sometimes, we call them dreams. We've been analyzing them and arguing about what they mean for our entire recorded history, and we still don't have a clear answer. Kiriath from across the room. You generate internal visual experiences during the vulnerable unconscious period, and you do not understand why. Correct. And this does not concern you. It's part of being human. You get used to it. Kiriath wrote something extremely long. What else? Said Tyreth, in the voice of someone who had underestimated how interesting the next 2 hours were going to be. So he told them. He told them about pain. The Velthari had discomfort signals, but not the acute, overwhelming system that humans called pain, and the concept that their single-hearted alien research subject could be temporarily incapacitated by a signal from their own nervous system seemed to strike them as both alarming and philosophically significant. He told them about hunger, about thirst, about the way temperature worked on human physiology in both directions. He explained sunburn, which required a sidebar about ultraviolet radiation, which required a sidebar about human skin color variation across geographic populations, which produced the most notes of the session. Your species presents different external colorations based on ancestral ultraviolet exposure, said Orvash, very carefully, as if she was building toward something. That's roughly accurate, yes. And these variations are not biologically significant in terms of function. Correct, surface variation. The underlying systems are the same. The Velthari present variation in skin tone based on lineage and regional origin, she said. We have historically considered these variations to carry deeper significance. She paused. We have been reconsidering this. Good, said Marcus. He thought of 15 years of interspecies contact, of all the arguments humans had had with themselves and each other, and the accumulated evidence. Surface variation on a common system is one of the most consistent findings in evolutionary biology. It shows up everywhere. Orvash wrote something and then set down her tablet and looked at him. You are saying, she said slowly, that our lineage variations are equivalent to human coloration variation. I'm saying the evolutionary logic is similar. Environmental adaptation producing visible differentiation on a common biological foundation. He paused. I'd want to see the actual genetics before I made a stronger claim. Karaith has the genetic data, said Orvesh. Karaith looked up from her station. I do. They looked at each other. They looked at Marcus. After lunch, Marcus said, I think we're going to have a very interesting afternoon. They had an extremely interesting afternoon. He had not expected, walking into this posting, to spend his third day co-reviewing Velthari population genetics with a biochemist who kept having what he could only describe as conceptual revelations in real time. But that was where the morning's assessment questions had led, and he followed the thread because the thread was genuinely fascinating, and because the look on Karaith's face when a piece of data aligned with a new theoretical framework was something he hadn't seen in a long time and had missed. That look was the reason he'd gotten into science in the first place. The days developed a rhythm. He was not technically confined to Unit 12. The Conclave's medical division was a campus-sized structure, and he had access to the common areas, the meal halls, the exercise facilities. But Unit 12 pulled him back consistently, and he stopped thinking of it as a constraint after the first week. Karaith wanted to know about human biochemistry and asked questions for hours that Marcus answered to the best of his ability, flagging where his knowledge ended. She was rigorous and she was skeptical, and whenever he gave an answer she didn't expect, she wrote it down with the kind of concentrated attention that he associated with people who were genuinely building something. Orvash, the physiological monitor, turned out to be studying movement, specifically the kinetics of beings with bilateral symmetry and two locomotion limbs, which was uncommon in the Velthari's catalog of known species. She spent an entire morning having Marcus walk, run, climb, stop, and move in various ways while she tracked the motion. He felt slightly absurd. She seemed transfixed. You balance entirely on 2 points, she said, after an hour of this. 2 feet, yes. You have no tail for counterbalance, no auxiliary contact points. You maintain upright stance through. She reviewed her data, a continuous series of microcorrections. We call it walking. You call it walking, she said, in the tone of someone making a note that contained significant philosophical weight. It is an extraordinary act of ongoing controlled falling. Marcus had never thought about it quite that way. I suppose it is. How do you not simply topple? Practice, we start young. She looked at him. You learn to walk. The process of learning includes falling. Extensively. She wrote something very long. Part 4, the surrounding. The surrounding, as Marcus came to think of it, had begun before he even fully registered it. It was not aggressive. It was not intimidating. It was the organic result of genuine curiosity concentrated in a small space, and it looked like this. He would be reviewing data at a workstation, and within 20 minutes, 3 researchers would have migrated to adjacent stations without any particular reason other than to be near the thing they were studying. He would be eating his midday meal in the unit's small common room, and by the time he finished, the entire unit had found reasons to be present. He would be walking the corridor back from the exercise facility, and the unit's researchers happened to be walking in the same direction. He started noticing it around the second week. He did not say anything, because he could feel that saying something would puncture something, and he wasn't sure he wanted to puncture it. There was a quality to it, the surrounding, that was entirely unlike anything he'd experienced in interspecies contact before. He had been to Velthari facilities as a Corps officer. He had attended formal meetings, treaty signings, diplomatic functions. In all of those, he had been aware of being the human in the room, the novelty, the outsider, the thing that required specific accommodations and careful protocol navigation. In Unit 12, he was the human in the room, and they were also curious about him, and that curiosity was not detached. It was not the curiosity of a collector examining a specimen. It was the curiosity of people who were interested in a person, which was something different enough that he'd had to sit with it for several days before he could name what it was. They wanted to know what he thought, not just what his biology did, what he thought about things. A researcher named Delveth, quiet, methodical, working on chemical signaling in xenobiological stress responses, had asked him on the 9th cycle whether he found the lab environment stressful. He'd said no, and she'd asked why not, and he'd tried to explain that he found structured intellectual work with genuinely curious people calming regardless of the species composition of the room. She had written something, and then she had looked at him and said, "What do you find stressful?" And he'd thought about it honestly and said, "Bureaucracy. Regulations that prioritize the appearance of safety over actual safety. Long stretches of time where I'm not allowed to think." She had looked at him for a moment and then said, "The core must be very difficult for you," and the accuracy of that had surprised him into silence. Another researcher, Uvash, theoretical models, one of the three who'd been near the display wall on his first day, had started leaving things at his workstation. Not gifts exactly, just items of potential interest. A geological sample from a mission she'd participated in 5 years ago, a printed copy of a paper on carbon-based chemistry that she thought might be relevant to something he'd said, a small Velthari plant in a sealed growth unit because she'd heard him mention that humans liked green things. He'd thanked her for each one, and she'd said each time that it was relevant to the research, which it sometimes technically was, and he'd accepted this framing because it let them both be comfortable. He did not say anything about the surrounding, because he was fairly certain that if he named it, they would become self-conscious about it and it would stop, and he did not want it to stop. Instead, he started being more deliberate. He started asking questions back. "Tyrath," he said on the 8th cycle, sitting across from her at the research table while she reviewed his biochemical results from Karayath's latest round of tests. "Why xenobiology, specifically?" She looked up, the inner eyes, which were the ones that meant she was paying attention. "What do you mean?" "You have 400 years of Velthari history behind you, interstellar travel for the last 300. You've encountered, what, 47 known species? 52 currently. 52 species. Why spend time studying the differences when you could study the things you have in common?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the lab's viewport, the asteroid field they were stationed near drifted in slow silence. The same field the original film seed carried, the one his mind translated as vast patience, stars waiting for something worth waiting for. "Because the differences tell you more," she said finally. "Anyone can look at two species and find the similarities. Bilateral symmetry, carbon-based chemistry, neurological information processing. These are almost universal among spacefaring species. They are table stakes." She set down her tablet. "But the differences tell you why. Why this planet? Why this gravity? Why this particular solution to this particular problem?" A pause. "The differences are the story." Marcus looked at her. "That's exactly why I got into evolutionary biology." She met his gaze. I know, I read your pre-core publications. He hadn't expected that. When? After you arrived. Your paper on convergent immune response architectures was, she paused, more sophisticated than I expected, given the rest of your file. The rest of my file involves navigation buoys and poker. Yes, the contrast is notable. She picked up her tablet again, but slowly. You wrote that the most interesting question in biology is not, what is this? But why did this happen here in this way at this time? I stand by it. So do I. She looked at him. The outer eyes had joined the inner ones now, which he was beginning to understand was what happened when something held her complete attention. This is why I requested a human subject. Not to document, not to catalog. She paused. Humans are the most recent spacefaring species. You have been among us for 15 years. In that time you have made more, she seemed to search for the word, asymmetric impacts than any species we have encountered. Asymmetric impacts. You are not the strongest, not the largest, not the longest-lived. Your biology is, by certain metrics, fragile. She tilted her head slightly, which the Velthari did when they were working through something carefully. And yet you are everywhere. You negotiate, you improvise. You find solutions that should not work and implement them before anyone thinks to object. You taught docking officers to play poker. A pause. You rerouted a diplomatic convoy through a meteor field and the convoy arrived safely. The shortcut was 4 hours faster than the standard route. I checked. She held his gaze. The question I want to answer, Lieutenant Commander, is not what humans are. It is why humans happen the way they do. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. That, he said, might take longer than 60 cycles. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile. The Velthari didn't smile the way humans did. The musculature was different, but a shift in the area around her inner eyes that he was starting to understand was the thing that functioned like a smile. I have submitted an extension request, she said. Part 5. What the other 11 were actually doing. By the third week, Marcus had cataloged the unit's research interests and cross-referenced them with what they kept asking him about, and he had arrived at a conclusion. He was fairly certain no one in Unit 12 had made explicit to themselves. They weren't just studying human biology. They were studying him. Not as a specimen, not as a representative sample. As an individual, which was, he realized, an entirely different thing, and perhaps the more interesting research project. Karaith had begun scheduling their biochemistry discussions around his meal times so they could talk while he ate, because she had realized he thought more freely when his hands were occupied, and he wasn't focused on performing. She was also, Marcus had noticed, gradually increasing the complexity of the food she selected for the unit's common room. She had found the Velthari analog for capsaicin, and was testing how much heat he could tolerate with an interest that was scientific but not entirely scientific. You enjoy this, she said, watching him eat a preparation she'd labeled Unit 12 Experiment 7C on her tablet. It's very good. What's in it? The spice compound is derived from. I mean generally. She paused, pressed seed grains, cultured protein, the oil of a plant that has no Terran equivalent. She watched him take another bite. You are not distressed. Why would I be distressed? The last 3 visitors to Unit 12 who ate Velthari preparation found it. She checked her notes. Aggressively unpleasant. I spent 4 years eating ship rations, Marcus said. Anything that has a genuine flavor profile is an improvement. Karaith wrote something. She was always writing something. He had started to find it comforting. You adapt, she said, quickly. It's a human thing. Yes, she looked at him over her tablet. Tell me why. So he told her. The evolutionary history of human adaptability, broad dietary range, tolerance for environmental variation, the cognitive flexibility that came from social species problem solving. He talked for 40 minutes while she ate nothing and wrote continuously. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation, 3 other researchers had materialized at the edges of the common room, ostensibly getting things from the preparation unit but not leaving. He noticed. He kept talking. He gestured more when he talked, which he'd been doing since childhood, and by the time he finished his meal, all 4 of them were standing at various angles around him like moons finding orbit. He thought, there it is again. He thought, I don't actually mind. Orvash had begun asking him to demonstrate things. It had started with walking, then moved through running, then climbing. There was a structural maintenance ladder on the unit's far wall that he'd used without thinking, and she had immediately appeared with monitoring equipment. Now she asked in the mornings what he planned to do that day, and he had started planning more movement-heavy activities than strictly necessary because her focus was so complete and so genuine that it felt rude not to give her good data. He was teaching her about bipedal locomotion. She was teaching him about Velthari physiology, and both of them had started drawing diagrams. You gesture with your hands when you explain things, she said, on the 19th cycle. I know habits. Does it help you think? He considered it. I'm not sure if it helps me think or just happens because I'm thinking. Those are different. Maybe not, he looked at her. Why? Because I have started doing it. She extended her lower arm slightly and moved her hands, a small, imprecise gesture that didn't mean anything specific but had the asterisk quality of meaning something. When I am working through a problem, in your manner. He looked at her hands. The gesture was human in a way that was also entirely Velthari, and the combination was so strange and so endearing that he had to take a moment. That's he started. Is it wrong? I can stop. No, it's good, keep it. He paused. That's what convergence looks like in real time. She did the gesture again, more deliberately, and wrote something down. A researcher named Tharev had the strangest specialty in the unit, acoustic biology, specifically the role of sound production and reception in interspecies communication. She was studying the question of why vocal communication had evolved independently in so many spacefaring species when chemical signaling was, energetically, far more efficient. She had asked Marcus to read aloud for her on the 14th cycle, which he'd done, a section from the paper on convergent immune architecture, and she had listened with her eyes half closed and a monitoring array trained on his vocal output, and when he'd finished, she'd sat quietly for a long moment. You produce an extraordinary range of frequencies, she said. Humans have a wide vocal band. We use it for communication, music, emotional expression. Music, she tilted her head, organized sound for what purpose? All of them, social bonding, emotional processing, religious practice, aesthetic pleasure, memory formation, cultural transmission. He paused. We've been making music since before we had writing. Can you? She stopped. She seemed uncertain, which he hadn't seen her be before. Could you produce a sample? He thought about it. He was not, by his own assessment, a particularly good singer. He was adequate, but adequate was probably sufficient data. He sang a few bars of something, a slow melody, nothing with words, the kind of thing he'd heard his grandmother sing and had absorbed without realizing it. Low, quiet, unhurried. When he stopped, Tharev was looking at him with the most openly moved expression he had seen on any Velthari in 15 years of contact. Her lower arms had come up, and her upper arms had spread slightly, and all 4 eyes were fixed on him, and she said nothing for a long moment. That, she said finally, is an extraordinary thing to do with a respiratory system. We've had a lot of practice. Can you do it again? More, different, is there a different type? He sang something faster, something with more variation in it. Tharev's monitoring array was tracking everything. 3 researchers had stopped working to listen. Orvash had come in from the equipment room and was standing in the doorway. By the time he stopped the second time, 5 members of the unit were in the main lab at angles that were, he noticed, exactly the surrounding configuration. He was starting to understand that the surrounding happened when something he did landed in a way that exceeded their existing model of what he would do. Every time he extended beyond their expectation, the orbit tightened a little. "I could teach you some," he said, "if you want." Thariv looked at him, then she looked at the monitoring array, then she looked at her colleagues. "Yes," she said, "we want." The researcher he'd had the least contact with was named Sevesh. She worked at the far end of the lab on what he'd gathered was theoretical modeling, abstract representations of biological systems that he wasn't fully equipped to follow, but which had the spare, crystalline quality of very good mathematics. She was older than most of the unit, he thought. Her markings were more complex, more layered. She didn't join the general drift toward wherever Marcus was. She stayed at her station and she watched. He went to her on the 22nd cycle, pulled up a chair at the empty station beside hers and sat. She looked at him. "Sevash," he said, "what are you working on?" A silence. Then, a theoretical model for adaptive speciation under accelerated environmental change. "The Kaveth data." She looked at him more sharply. The outer eyes came in. "You know the Kaveth data." "I cited it in a paper before I joined the Corps. Convergent immune architecture across 1,100 light-years of separation. Extraordinary data set." He looked at her display, which showed a modeling interface he couldn't fully parse. "Are you trying to explain how it happened or predict where it might happen again?" Another silence, longer. "Both," she said. "What's your current obstacle?" She studied him. The look was the same thoroughness that Tyrath had, the same complete attention but quieter, more patient. "The model requires a parameter I cannot satisfactorily define." She searched for the word willingness of a system to change while remaining itself. Marcus thought about that. Adaptive stability. Yes, precisely that. It is easy to model change. It is easy to model stability. The combination, she shook her head. The combination is the difficult thing. "Because they're not actually opposites," Marcus said. She looked at him. "Change and stability. They're not opposites. The most stable systems are the ones that change in response to pressure and return to equilibrium. A tree bends in wind and straightens after. A species modifies and persists." He paused. "The parameter you're missing isn't a measure of how much the system changes. It's a measure of how strong its return-to-self impulse is." Sevash had gone very still in the way that Marcus had learned to associate with a Velthari, who had just received information that reorganized something important. "Return to self," she said. "Biological identity persistence. How much the core system maintains itself even while the periphery changes." He looked at her display. "Is that modelable with what you have?" "It is." She turned back to her interface. "Give me a moment." He watched her work. After a while she started talking through what she was building, not explaining to him exactly but thinking aloud, and he responded when he had something to add and was quiet when he didn't, and the morning passed this way without either of them noticing. When the midday alert chimed, she looked up and seemed mildly surprised that time had passed. "You are useful," she said, which from Sevash had the weight of a significant compliment. "I've been told that occasionally," Marcus said. "Usually after the part where I'm annoying." Something in her expression shifted. "You have not been annoying," she said carefully, "since your arrival." He thought about the navigation buoys, the convoy, the poker. "I'm on good behavior." "Is that what this is?" "Mostly." He looked around the lab. The unit was at work, Karaith bent over samples, Orvash reviewing motion data, a cluster of 3 near the display wall discussing something with quick overlapping Velthari that he couldn't fully follow. The slow warm-to-cool lighting cycle, the faint herbal smell. "Mostly it's that I'm somewhere I want to be." Sevash followed his gaze around the room and then back to him. "Adaptive stability," she said quietly, as if confirming something. Part 6, The Night Shift. The Conclave's medical division ran on a 36-hour cycle, and Unit 12 worked flexible shifts. Marcus had discovered, around the third week, that the lab was never entirely empty. Someone was always working, not because they were required to be, but because Velthari researchers of this caliber simply preferred it. He started staying later. Not every night, but some nights, when the main shift had gone and the lab was quieter and the lighting settled into its late-cycle cool blue, he would be at a workstation with his own research, and one or two others would be there, and the silence was the kind that had texture to it. On the 21st cycle, it was Delvath, the chemical signaling researcher, who stayed. She didn't talk much. She worked in a focused silence that he found easy to be near. Around the middle of the late cycle, she said, without looking up from her samples, "You sing to yourself when you're thinking." He hadn't realized he'd been doing it. "Sorry, I can stop." "Don't," she adjusted something on her sample array. "It is useful data. Also, the pause, it is pleasant. I have told Thariv." "What did Thariv say?" "She said she knows. She has been monitoring ambient sound in the lab for the past 8 cycles, and you sing in a pattern that correlates with problem-solving states." He thought about that. "She's building a model of my cognitive audio output." "She is building a model of your cognitive audio output." He found this so entirely characteristic of Unit 12 that it produced a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in longer than he could precisely remember. "Tell her I'll give her a deliberate sample set if she wants. Controlled conditions." Delvath made a note. "She will want." On the 25th cycle, it was Uvesh, who had brought him the small sealed plant and who had once described her theoretical modeling work as asking the universe what it was planning. In a tone that suggested she considered this both absurd and necessary. She sat near him and they talked for an hour about prediction in complex systems. Not her specific model, just the general philosophy of it, whether prediction was a form of understanding or just pattern matching dressed up in mathematical language. "Pattern matching is how we understand anything," Marcus said. "But understanding implies something beyond the pattern," Uvesh said. "If I predict that a system will collapse and it collapses, I have matched a pattern. But do I understand why it collapsed, or only that it did? Maybe why is just a more complete pattern." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a very unsatisfying answer." "I know. I've been unsatisfied by it for 20 years. And yet you work with it." "I work against it. Every good research question I've ever asked was because the pattern wasn't complete enough yet." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. One of the outer eyes was doing something he hadn't catalogued yet, a slight movement toward closed that he thought might be something like fond recognition. "You are," she started. "I know," he said. She made a small sound that was almost the Velthari laugh. "You do not know what I was going to say. You were going to say I'm unusual." "I was going to say you are good company *," she said, with the deliberateness of someone saying something they decided to say and didn't want misunderstood. He looked at the plant in its sealed growth unit on the corner of his workstation. "Thank you for the plant," he said. "It is relevant to the research," she said. "Uvesh." "It is." "Uvesh." A longer pause. "It seemed like something you would want," she said finally, in the tone of someone admitting something they decided wasn't worth hiding anymore. "It is," he said. "Thank you." On the 28th cycle, it was Tyreth. She was at the central workstation, which was hers by unspoken consensus, reviewing something on a display that showed what looked like a genetic mapping interface. He was at the adjacent station, running a literature search on convergent speciation that had started as relevant to Sevash's model, and had become genuinely interesting to him on its own terms. They worked in silence for a while. "Marcus," she said. He looked up. She had used his given name. She hadn't done that before. She was looking at the genetic mapping display, not at him. "When you were in evolutionary biology, before the core, what was your specific research focus?" "Adaptive immune architecture in isolated populations," he said. "How species that had been geographically separated for long periods developed analogous defenses against unrelated pathogen types." "The Kaveth paper." "That came later. My foundational work was Terran, island populations mostly. How species on isolated islands develop solutions to problems independently of their mainland relatives." She turned to look at him, all four eyes. "You have always studied convergence." "I suppose I have." "And then you joined the Corps." "The expansion happened while I was in graduate school. The first contact was—" He paused, thinking back. The first contact had happened when he was 23, and it had rearranged everything. I couldn't stay in a lab and study Earth island populations after that. The entire premise of my work had just gotten 300% more interesting. "You abandoned a career." "I expanded it." He looked at her. "I'm still studying convergence. I'm just doing it in person." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her display. "My research for this session was originally about general xenobiological patterns," she said. "I have redirected it since your arrival." "To what?" "To human speciation within the broader context of the expansion." She pulled up a secondary display beside the genetic map. "Humans have been in contact with 52 species over 15 years. In that time, you have developed what appears to be not biological change. The timeline is too short, but behavioral and cognitive adaptation strategies that are specific to multi-species contact environments." He looked at the display. The data she'd compiled was extensive and precise. "You've been documenting the poker games." "I have been documenting the poker games, the navigation buoy modification, the meteor field convoy, the 17 consecutive gambling victories, the card game tutorials left with docking staff." She paused. "And 62 other incidents in your core file that share the same pattern." "What pattern?" "You find the rule that everyone is following," she said, "and you find the reason the rule exists, and you find the edge of it. And then you operate in the space between the rule and its reason, not in violation of the intent, in excess of the expectation." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's a very generous reading of my disciplinary record." "It is an accurate one." She pulled up a different view. "In every incident the outcome was positive. The convoy arrived early. The navigation buoys were recalibrated. The gambling victories were achieved without deception. Counting cards is a cognitive skill, not a violation of game rules." The docking staff who learned poker reported. She checked a note, improved morale and an interest in probability theory. She looked at him. "You were sent here as a punishment. The Queen chose this posting because she expected it to be limiting." And instead," said Tyrath, "you have restructured Sevash's theoretical model, contributed to Karaith's dietary adaptation research, provided Orvash with movement data she describes as unprecedented in quality, and spent approximately 40 hours in informal biological discussion with members of this unit that several of them have described as the most productive conversations of their current research cycle." Marcus leaned back. "You've been keeping track." "I am a scientist. I track things." "Is that what this is for you?" The question landed in the quiet lab and sat there. Outside the viewport, the asteroid field drifted. The lighting was at its coolest blue, the faint herbal smell that he'd started associating with feeling calm. Tyrath looked at her display for a moment, then she looked at him. "No," she said, "not only." Part 7, the 61st cycle. The extension request came through on the 45th cycle. 60 additional standard cycles, authorized by the Conclave's Research Division Director under academic necessity, a formal designation that meant the work was considered significant enough to override the original disciplinary term. Marcus read the notification on his data tablet and sat with it for a while. The unit found out via their own notification system, and the response was characteristic. Karayath made a note. Orvash asked him to participate in an extended movement study. Sevash showed him her updated model, which was now three-dimensional and genuinely beautiful, and the rest of the unit shifted their arm configurations in the direction he had catalogued as satisfaction. Tyrath found him at his workstation in the late cycle. "You received the extension notification," she said. "I did." "You are not," she searched for the word, "distressed." "No." He looked at the display wall, where the unit's combined research data was pinned in organized clusters. His own contributions were scattered through several of them: notes, corrections, additions, the kind of collaborative residue that builds up when people work together over time. "I'm not distressed." She sat down at the adjacent station, not at her own workstation, the one beside his, he noticed. "The Queen will expect a report," she said, "on whether the posting achieved its intended purpose." "As a punishment?" "Yes." He considered the lab. The researchers at their stations in the various configurations he could now read fluently. The lighting in its slow, warm cycle rhythm. The smell that meant work and calm and something he didn't have a word for yet. "What are you going to tell her?" Tyreth was quiet for a moment. Her lower arms were in the position he'd catalogued in the courtroom, but her upper arms had shifted, slightly extended, not quite forward, which was a configuration he hadn't mapped yet. He filed it for later. "I will tell her," said Tyrath, "that the posting did not achieve its intended purpose. Because I'm not suffering. Because punishment was not the appropriate framework." She looked at him directly, all four eyes. "The appropriate framework was collaboration. We are better researchers for having you here. You are," she paused, "you appear to be better also." "I am better also," he said, "by a significant margin." Then the Queen's judgment was wrong in its intent, but correct in its outcome. Which is, I suspect, something she understood when she made it. Marcus thought about the courtroom, the 12 tiers of Velthari women in the amusement configuration. Queen Saravath saying Unit 12 has been waiting quite some time with that faint adjustment in her expression. "She knew," he said. "I believe she knew. She sent me here as a gift." "She sent you here as a gift," Tyrath agreed, "wrapped in a punishment which is very like her." A pause, and you are still surrounded. He looked around the lab. Several researchers had migrated toward his side of the room in the last hour without any particular stated reason. The arms, the quiet attention. 11 beings who had started by studying him and had, without anyone deciding this was happening, become something closer to colleagues. Something closer than that. "I noticed that," he said. "I thought you had. Why didn't you tell them to stop?" She was quiet. The asteroids drifted outside, the lighting breathed. "Because," she said, "I did not want them to." The configuration of her upper arms extended, not quite forward. He looked at it again. He had been cataloging Velthari arm positions for 7 weeks now, and he thought he understood most of them, but this one he hadn't seen before on Tyrath, and he wanted to understand it correctly. "What does that mean?" he said. "The arms." She looked at her own upper arms, as if slightly surprised to find them in that position. Then she looked back at him. "It is not a research term," she said. "I know. It means," she paused for long enough that he understood she was choosing carefully. "It means that a system has found something it did not know it was looking for, and it does not want to categorize it yet, because categorization would change it." Marcus held that for a moment. Outside the viewport, A small asteroid caught the distant star's light and glinted once. "Adaptive stability," he said. Something in her expression shifted, the thing that functioned like a smile, and this time it was warmer than he had seen it before. "Adaptive stability," she said. Epilogue, Cycle 90. The Queen's summons came on the 89th cycle, with the expected formality and the less expected phrasing. The conclave requests Lieutenant Commander Hale's attendance at a review hearing to assess the outcome of his disciplinary posting. Note: this is not a disciplinary hearing. The note added, Unit 12 is also requested to attend. The judgment hall was the same as he remembered: the carved asteroid, the rings, the layered gravity. This time Marcus walked in with 11 Velthari researchers in formation around him. Karaith on his left, Orvash on his right, Sevesh slightly behind. The others spread around them like a constellation. The 12 tiers were full again. Queen Saravath sat at the apex with the same expression she'd worn the first time. "You are a very interesting problem, Lieutenant Commander," and watched them file into the chamber floor. "Senior Xenobiologist Tyrath," said the Queen, "your assessment of the posting outcome." Tyrath stepped forward. She was carrying a data scroll, her research report on the unit's work over 90 cycles, which Marcus had read and which was extraordinary. "The posting produced significant advances in 3 active research streams," she said. "The Kavath convergence model, which researcher Sevash has now extended into predictive territory that has been peer-reviewed and accepted for the Conclave's primary xenobiology journal. Dietary and biochemical adaptation research, which researcher Karaith has compiled into a dataset that represents the most detailed documentation of human nutritional biology currently available, and a locomotion and kinetics study, compiled by researcher Orvash, which is the first Velthari-authored systematic analysis of bipedal ambulation in a spacefaring context." A pause. In addition to the formal research outputs, unit productivity across all streams increased by 31% over the posting period, which the unit attributes to the informal collaborative discussions with Lieutenant Commander Hale. A murmur through the tiers. "And the Lieutenant Commander himself," said Queen Saravath. Tyrath turned slightly and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and he thought, "There is no word for this in either of our languages yet, but there will be, eventually." Lieutenant Commander Hale contributed a co-authored theoretical paper on adaptive speciation, which is under review, she said. He also recalibrated the unit's data indexing system, taught 3 researchers to play chess, a murmur of something through the tiers, and has been requested to remain by the unit's unanimous agreement. Queen Saravath looked at Marcus, the same expression as the first time and yet different, warmer, or perhaps he was better at reading it now. "Lieutenant Commander Hale," she said, "do you have anything to say?" He thought about what to say. He thought about the lab and the lighting and the smell that meant calm. He thought about Sevash's model and Karaith's data and Orvash's notes on walking. He thought about Tyreth sitting beside him at the late cycle stations, all 4 eyes, talking about convergence. "Your Majesty," he said, "the next time you want to punish me, you might try sending me somewhere I won't enjoy." A breath across the 12 tiers, and then, unmistakably, undeniably, laughter. Full, genuine Velthari laughter moving through the rings of the chamber like a wave. Queen Saravath looked at him for a long moment, 400 years and something like amusement. "I will take that under advisement," she said. "Welcome to the conclave, Lieutenant Commander." Marcus looked back at the 11 women standing around him, the constellation, the orbit, the surrounding that had never been containment but had always been something else. "Thank you," he said. "I'm glad to be here." Outside the carved asteroid, the stars continued their slow ancient work. The same stars, always the same stars, but the paths between them changed, and the beings who walked those paths changed, And sometimes, if the conditions were right and the timing was improbable and someone got sent somewhere as a punishment that turned out to be exactly where they needed to be, something new came into the world that hadn't been there before, and neither side had words for it yet, and that was fine. That was the beginning of things. Word count, words duration, ~61, 5 minutes at 160 WPM *. Film DNA extracted from Cheyer Yezeteyer Nekazeveyozedam to the Stars by Hard Ways, 1981. Vibe elements absorbed, cosmic grandeur and human dignity under alien institutional pressure, cold formal settings turned warm, the slow burn discovery of belonging in the stars, scientific wonder as a form of tenderness.